in a day or so that people who missed the recording have a chance to to see it. There's a number of people who couldn't be here today, and earlier I was saying that they had sent their regrets. Life happens, so they're busy with those things, and they'll see this later. So, and we've been discussing for the last while taking refuge in the Buddha, that prayer that we do, the refuge prayer. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. And we've been exploring, the life of the Buddha as a way of understanding what it means to take refuge in the Buddha. And just as a lightning recap of what we've done before, the Buddha is not a god in any normal sense that that word is used. So he isn't living forever. He isn't somewhere off in heaven, as some kind of cosmic Buddha principle that we're praying to, like people might pray to a god. Buddha was born, he lived, he died. And he set in motion this series of teachings, and he gave us an example of what your life might be like if you lived a life into being awake, into enlightenment. And so to say I take refuge in the Buddha, I'm taking refuge in the example of the Buddha. So I thought a few weeks ago it would be useful to think about, well, what about his life is exemplary? Because there are many things about his life that you might not choose to follow. So we have looked at in the last couple of weeks, there is a critical incident that happens in his life, and it's usually told that his life of pleasure and privilege in the palace is interrupted when he meets, when he encounters an old person, a very sick person, a corpse being carried to its burial, and then a wandering meditator. And those four encounters propel the Buddha out of a life of privilege into a life of seeking. So, and then we talked about his life of seeking. And traditionally, the story is told that he spent 6 years or more wandering and practicing with different teachers, mastering different yogic disciplines. And each one takes him a little way towards the answer, but doesn't quite resolve what he's looking to do. He's trying to understand the problem of suffering and how one would free oneself from that constant sense of struggle and dissatisfaction and anxiety about life. And so he makes a number of, he'll go down the road of one practice and then for a year or so and go, well, that's not it. And then he has to go try and find another one. And we talked about how our life of practice is sort of propelled forward by the mistakes we made. We try one thing and then we try another, and eventually we find something we hope that works. So our life story of the Buddha took him to, he had finished his seeking, and he was so weak, he was almost dead. He had almost starved himself to death. And so he resolves, we're going to take the Buddha's story to the moment of his enlightenment. He had resolved that that wasn't working. The life of deprivation and ascetic, complete discipline didn't take him to freedom, to liberation, to enlightenment. And so, okay, it's time to relax a bit. And he sits down under this tree, on the banks of a river, and a local girl from one of the villages comes and sees that this almost skeleton-like figure is sitting under the tree, goes back home and brings him a very simple meal of rice milk and gruel, like just almost like baby food, because he hadn't eaten much, right? And he gets a little bit of strength back. He gets enough strength back that he decides to sit under that tree and work with his mind until either he achieves freedom or he dies. And so he has complete resolve, and he sits down, and the story is told many different ways. He sits as long as it takes, would be a good way to say it, right? And then on the last night of his meditation, sometimes it's as if it all happened in the one day. Maybe it happened that way, maybe it took longer. But on the final night that he was meditating, he has 3 progressive insights, which is why this talk started with the question of what's an insight you had that there was a before this insight happened and now I'm different afterwards. And these 3 insights are the key moments that lead to the Buddha's enlightenment. Sometimes enlightenment, it's one of those religious words or sort of fantastical words, and there's all kinds of things you could say about it. And all kinds of illusions and fantasies, like when I get enlightened, I'll have only happy thoughts, or I'll be able to levitate, or I'll have some magical power, or all the things that happened to me in the past will be healed, right? You can have all kinds of magical thoughts. But that's not what happened to the Buddha. He had these three insights. And as meditators, these are the three that we really focus on taking in and absorbing. And if you have these three insights, then you have seeded the ground of your awareness with the seeds of enlightenment. And just as surely if you plant corn seeds, you grow corn. If you plant the seeds of enlightenment, enlightenment will flower, when it's ready. So here's the first insight, the first seed. And the way that I like to tell this story is, in a very old way of measuring time, there are 3 watches of the night and then dawn. So in the first watch of the night, which you might think of as like from sunset to midnight, right? The Buddha, he's sitting there, he's doing a meditation very similar to what we did, that breath coming in, going out meditation, settling his mind, and he understands that everything is impermanent. No thing lasts forever, including this thing, including the ego thing, the Brian thing, or whatever you call yourself, including your ego, your story. It all has a beginning and consequently will have an end. We'll all die. No one alive today will be alive, as far as we can tell, 150 years from now, right? We will all die and pass away. And just like our grandmothers and grandfathers and great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers, we will be in the past, right? Every living thing, every physical thing. I have a favorite coffee cup that is now, the decal is coming, it says Dad. The decal's coming off of it. It's got crackling inside. The glaze isn't perfect anymore. Eventually, I'll drop this in a moment of mindfulness and the handle will come off and it will no longer be my favorite. And it will go to the back of the shelf until it's used for something else, and then it will disappear. Even your favorite things, your cherished things. Right? One of the things that was being talked about was spilling a glass of water on a computer. That's a way of understanding impermanence. It was working, then it's not, right? Even our sun will pass away. I have no idea how many millions or billions of years in the future, but eventually the furnace of hydrogen that makes the sun will be exhausted. It's just a matter of time. And so in that first watch of the night, if you understand that, and you understand that I am not a solid, forever, permanent thing, my ego, my story, right? This is part of what makes Buddhism very different from other spiritual practices and religions, because others have this story of a soul that goes on forever. And nothing lasts forever. You can't find a soul that lasts forever, right? So he understood that. Interestingly, as he understood that, it opened up into the second watch of the night. So let's say from midnight till 2 a.m. He understood how everything was interconnected. So there's a fancy word for this, which is the self-arising interconnection of all things, or praticca samutpada, the interdependent co-arising of everything. But everything's, Thich Nhat Hanh, the person whose precepts we work with, he had this wonderful chapter in a book that the whole world is in this page. He's, writing about a piece of paper. And on this piece of paper, there are the clouds and the grass and the sun, where the fields, where, the fibers grew that were harvested, and then the mother and father of the person who harvested it, and the person who drove the truck, and the person who mined the minerals that made the truck, and the workers that drilled for the oil that went into the truck. And the whole world is in this little page of printing, right? And the Buddha understood that everything's interconnected. It's not only impermanent, but it's constantly arising and connected with itself and then falling away like a kaleidoscope. And out of that insight, there arises great compassion. Because we're used to thinking of ourselves as separate. I'm over here, you're over there, and then I could either like you and feel good about you or dislike you and feel bad about you. And then when bad things happen to you, maybe I'm satisfied, maybe I'm judgmental. But if you see, we're all connected. Whenever anything happens to anyone, it touches you. So even if, another person is reaping the results of, lots of things they've done, and it seems like that's the way it should be, their suffering still touches you. So great compassion arising. So he's understood impermanence in the first watch of the night, the interbeing, to use Thich Nhat Hanh's word. Everything interbees, right? And then it's the third watch of the night. So he's had this profound, you could also say about that insight that that's understanding karma, that he understood how everything worked and touched everything else. Right? And then in the third watch of the night, just before dawn, the Buddha, his mind is completely still. He's not holding on to anything being solid or forever. He's understood how everything connects, and a great compassion has arisen. And then he has a key insight into what, let's call it mind, what the mind is, or what the experience of awareness or consciousness is. Right? You could use the three of them sort of as synonyms. Let's call it mind. And he realizes that the mind is not a thing, and it's very vividly there. Right? It doesn't have a start. Like it's always there. You can't find when it started. If it never started, it can't end. So it is beginningless and endless, this experience we call mind. Not a thing. It doesn't have any parts. There's not like a left of my mind and a right of my mind and a front of my mind and a back, right? So it's without parts. There are fancy words for this. Right? That's called uncompounded. It doesn't have compounding parts, parts that fit together, right? Beginningless. Sometimes they'll say unborn. So it is unborn, uncompounded, and yet it is full of knowing, right? And that's called brilliant. And when he understood that, enlightenment happened. So those are the three key insights: impermanence, interconnection, and the nature of the mind as unborn, uncompounded, open brilliance. And then dawn happens. And in the story, right, the forces of confusion are represented in the religious myth or the religious story of the Buddha's awakening. There is a god of confusion called Mara. And Mara has 4 very seductive daughters that he sends as his powerful emissaries to distract the Buddha from his enlightenment. And I won't remember all 4 of them, but one is all about pleasure, the other is about the fear of death, etc. There are 4 very compelling distractions. And they're tempting the Buddha and dancing around him and trying to, scare him out of his enlightenment. And Mara rises up and thunders at the Buddha, "Who gives you the right to say you're enlightened?" And the Buddha very gently reaches out with his right hand. He's sitting with his hands and just resting in his lap. And with his right hand, he reaches out and touches the earth. Now, what many of us in the West don't know is that the earth goddess was a very powerful protector of insight in ancient India. And her name is Priti Devata. And she arises in the form of a snake and, big cobra, and spreads herself out over the Buddha. And he says, "The earth is my witness. My experience is what I'm trusting in." And the forces of confusion evaporate. So I would say the point of this story for us, other than being a wonderful story, right, very cinematic, is that to achieve enlightenment, you need to work on three critical insights and then develop confidence in your experience. The insights are the insight into um, impermanence, which is key into understanding that you're not solid or real. The insight into everything being connected, that is key to the arising of compassion and understanding openness or shunyata, open, empty, full, sometimes translated as emptiness, right? And then the third is the insight into how mind actually is: unborn, uncompounded, open brilliance. And when those three seeds are planted and watered by experience and practice, then you can rest in your own experience like the Buddha and call on the earth goddess, like the earth is my witness. My own experience is the ground that I'm on. So when we take refuge in the Buddha, in that prayer, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha, we're taking refuge or finding our example in a person who went through the process of those insight moments to change who he was from before and after. Before he sits down, he is still asleep, still wondering, looking for the answer. And after those insights, he has the answer. He has enlightenment. And he lives another 40 years, which is more of the story to talk about at another time. So I thought that would be interesting to explore today. And that's where I'm going to pause the talk and pause the recording. And I'd love to hear what any of you think of that or anything else you would like to talk about.